Eddie, you happy this time? Excellent. If there aren't any questions, then I call upon the first speaker to open the case for the government. Everyone's okay with claps for that sequence?
Let's start with what we know for sure. Your basic material needs are met on the North Sentinel Island. That is distinct from large portions of the world population today. Firstly, on food. Food is secure. Compare this to people on the order of 100 million who suffer from wastage in childhood, who suffer from seasonal malnutrition. That means they can't get the nutrients that they need to grow up properly, that suffer from diminished IQ as a consequence from this, who go to bed hungry every night. I think the fear, moreover, of food insecurity is what drives a lot of people, particularly in the developing world, even if they are not themselves food insecure, to take massive risks, to be tolerant of horrible labor conditions, and generally allow themselves to suffer far more than any human being ought to be allowed to do. We think that on our side of the house, when you have food security that is a simple and guaranteed benefit, that means that you are a lot better off than these people. Secondly, on the climate. I would posit that climate change is going to do significant harm to global agriculture, particularly in the developing world. And the reason for this is because the crops that we currently use have evolved over the last 10,000 years in a very specific climate that has been bounded. When climate change exceeds those bounds, the very simple harm happens, which is that these crops are no longer viable. And I think to the extent that you can GMO or whatever, I think these are probably accessible to rich people, but they are unlikely to be accessible to the vast majority of the global poor who are locked out of this intellectual property by companies like Monsanto, who in many instances can't access these new technologies that may or may not solve the problems of climate change. On our side of the house, your agriculture is not fucked. See info slide. As a consequence, you have way better ability to manage these things, and this is all very good. Yeah.
Surely your odds of being born into extreme poverty are roughly similar to your odds of being born in a Western country, though, so it seems like both of those tail risks aren't super relevant compared to being born in Asia.
Yeah, okay, so here's the thing. Firstly, I would posit, I think this is actually what I genuinely believe. I saw this motion, I was like, this is a dumb OG. I don't think this is that dumb anymore. Is that you ought to be incredibly risk-averse about the suffering that poverty can possibly experience. As a wise man once said, when you play Russian roulette, the important thing is making sure that there are no bullets in the chamber, not increasing the payout that you might get if you were born in a Western society. And I think quite simply, the vast majority of people take risk aversion quite seriously and use risk aversion in the relevant ways in which they decide to live. No one is guaranteed EV maximizer. I think most of us want to live relatively straightforward lives with good benefits. Secondly, I would posit that you suffer from severe diminishing marginal utility on their side, which is to say, you might live with more luxuries and more material goods, but every single time you get a new material good that is less important than the first one that you acquire. On our side of the house, you acquire the two most important material goods, which is being protected from some of the most globally calamitous events that will happen with regards to climate change, and also being protected from food insecurity and the fear of it that you constantly experience. I think this means that we beat them on that front. And thirdly, I would posit that every one of their benefits, even if it is substantial, is not mentally perceived as substantial, because we exist on a hedonic treadmill. That is to say that when we look in the status quo today, our happiness is not linear in the amount of money we make, but rather what we see is happiness tends to decline significantly over time, and in many instances goes flat, for the simple reason that the more money you have, the more expectations you have, and the more you get disappointed. And as a consequence of this, I think even if you have a lot of wealth on their side, that wealth is not actually valued by you. Secondly, I want to talk about risks. And I would posit here that we live in a particularly unique time in human civilization where things are going generally well. That is not the world that they get to weigh on, because they have to go over the next 80 years of your human life. Humans have typically done things like entered war. Historically, most human beings who have been born and died in the same place under authoritarian states. Structurally speaking, we think technology is likely to destabilize the world and make it a lot worse. Firstly, because tech creates asymmetries with regards to control of individuals. We live in a unique time today where individuals have a lot of freedom, but I think this is not necessarily going to happen for the next 10 to 20 years, as technology makes it easier for states like China to export their authoritarianism and make it a lot easier for these states in order to continue oppressing their people. Secondly, I think AI is likely to make a lot of people unemployed, for the simple reason that human labor is now much more easily fungible with other targets. As a consequence of this, I think a lot of people will lose their jobs. It will affect white-collar workers first, but then quite quickly it will affect the blue-collar workers that do tasks that are relatively repetitive and systematized. As a consequence of this, labor will no longer be as necessary, and then capital interest will take over, and the vast majority of people, such as those people in Asia who have been uplifted through manufacturing, will no longer be uplifted. Thirdly, I think information will be controlled. That is to say that your ability to access new kinds of information or things about like other societies and be more culturally accepting will be limited. See again, China. Let's talk finally then about just geopolitics in real-world situations, because I think are useful to frame why risks are going to get worse. Things like Russia, which is rearming with nuclear weapons, or things like China, which is increasingly looking to invade Taiwan, where they talk about this and explain how these drones would operate on state media, when they run constant military exercises getting closer and closer to the Taiwanese islands. Things like Xi getting on state television and saying that he's preparing for war. All of these are harms that they have to accept as reasons as to why geopolitics will become continually less and less stable, and as a consequence of this destabilization, here is the way that you weigh this. I think there's one way, which they probably have to defend, for life to typically get better and wealth to typically accumulate, which is that these things cannot happen. When you enter a global war, the supply chains are disrupted, you don't get any more economic growth, in many instances you get recession, people have to die in these conflicts. I think that is something that is very difficult for them to defend against, especially given the risk aversion weighing I gave previously. Yeah.
Who do you think assign value to this hedonistic trade myth?
I think it is like society which tells you, and like expectations that you have, that say, I have seen this other person who has achieved this great success, and I think that this other person now is like my target. And that is a never-ending treadmill, because there's always someone higher up who has done more stuff, and like you never are satisfied as a consequence. I think finally then, I would posit just very briefly, that like North Sentinel Islands are unlikely to be a strategic target for any of these conflicts, because it's like not in a particularly important place, because aircraft carriers are the thing that you like need in the South China Sea, not like random islands with a bunch of like people living on them. I think as a consequence, you're actually immune from a lot of these. Finally, let's talk about emotional needs. Firstly, there's less conflict, because the concept of oppression comes from complex societal structures. It comes from things like media that tell you that you're oppressed, rather than individuals themselves being naturally pessimistic. I also just think you get simply less oppression on their side. Why? Because I think there's a smaller society, and that means that you are more able to empathize with the individuals in it. You know people by first name basis. You know that if you like harm them, that like their generations down the line will remember that harm. I think what this means is you're far less likely to harm people, and there's less oppression in the society overall. Secondly, I think as a consequence of the hedonic treadmill, we're able to escape this on our side, and I think here it is really important to note that while they might say that a like, meaningful life is one where you have high aspirations and you meet them, that is something that's better and easily attainable on our side, because it is much easier to help the people you care about when there are only 100 or so people that you care about than when there are literally billions and you are an insignificant speck in the global population. I think when it comes to living a meaningful and contentful life, you are far less likely to feel hopeless on our side, because there's a limited life that you live, and it means that the impacts that you can have are far more meaningful to you. And finally, I think you live in a more communitarian society in which there's a sense of belonging and acceptance, because the people that you know, the people that you like and trust, or you're surrounded by them, and I think that is a community that is very nice to grow up in and to live. We're very proud of those.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the first speaker for the opposition.
I prefer non-verbal POI, so just raise your hand. When outsiders come to the Northern Sentinel Islands, they viciously tear them apart and put their heads on stakes. We don't think this utopia, peace-filled, idyllic hunter-gatherer life that they're talking about is anywhere near the reality that they have to deal with in this debate. Few things. One, on setup and what our side is likely to look like and how you should weigh risk in this round. Two, why you're likely to have an extremely hard, short, and difficult life on their side. Lastly, on the meaning of happiness and why it's more easily achievable in our world. Firstly, on the setup. We think the most reasonable idea of being randomly born into the world is that you are the average person. And we think that likely you are born somewhere in Asia, you have a basic level of food security, and your chance of being extremely food insecure is the same as being built in an extremely wealthy Western country where you have a stable life. We think you probably have basic access to things like hospitals and education. You might not have a university degree, you might not have ultimate freedom. We think the average person does have access to technology. Second thing that I want to know is that if climate change doesn't affect the Northern Sentinel Islands, which are near the equator, very hot in a jungle climate, it's highly likely that the place you're randomly born into is also going to end up fine in this debate. We don't think this is an important factor, but even if so, every single government and every single company in the world has mutually assured incentives to stop climate change, because then everyone will die and all companies will stop being able to operate. So I think that the incentives to stop climate change are sufficient on either side of the house. How should you weigh risk in this round though? Because they say you should highly risk the idea that you're going to starve in a society, by the way, in the modern world, where advancements in technology, things like GMOs, have almost eradicated deaths, for example, of starvation. But on to my first argument then about a hard life and why we think the risk of imminent and short death is far higher, and you should weigh that risk far higher in the round. There are three things that I want to talk about. First thing that I want to talk about is childhood mortality. We have almost completely uprooted childhood mortality, or gotten rid of childhood mortality, or lowered the rates drastically in most countries that exist around the world today. That's for a few simple advances. The first is medicine. The most dangerous thing is that you're going to have a simple illness like pneumonia, like malaria, like dengue, that is going to take you out that you do not have, and there's no evidence that they have those technologies on the Northern Sentinel Islands. So I think the most likely thing, and the fact that plagues human history for literally the majority of time, is A, that you would just die before age 10, which is the reason the average lifespan was so short. Not that the average person died sooner, but so many children died. So not only is there the risk that you yourself die, we think that it is highly likely that when you grow up and that you have children, that at least one of your children die, and that you're forced to live through the devastating pain and grief of having one of the children that you gave birth to taken from you. But the second thing, again, is that we think illness is just going to be far more widespread and immediate. You don't have vaccines, you don't have antibiotics. Two technologies which have been generically spread and produced around the world and that people have widespread access to the point that after a global pandemic, we were able to get extremely wide vaccine coverage for the vast majority of the global population. We've eradicated malaria in places like Nigeria, for example. I think it's extremely significant that we've been able to mostly stop this. And we think that there's, again, not only a high chance that you die young, but there's some kind of massive disfigurement or some kind of thing that limits you for the rest of your life, that you're left blind, you're left incapable. We think that in those societies, we have no idea how those people are taken care of. The last thing that I want to talk about is toil and amount of time, which I think it's incredibly difficult to survive in these places that you're probably surrounded by an extremely hostile environment, which means you have to constantly build shelter, build against things like hurricane winds. You have to try not to die while you're hunting in the jungle, which means that you're likely to face a significant portion of your life just spent hunting, trying to make sure you have enough food to survive, trying to rebuild after cyclones and hurricanes. I think that this is going to be extremely difficult for you. The last thing that I want to talk about is just the stratification of society. Two things. One, all of the Northern Sentinel people we've seen have been men. This indicates to us that the hunter-gatherers and those that have physical power and strength, with a 50% chance, by the way, of being born of women on their side of the house, you are likely to be born in a society that values strength, that values physicality and hunting, which means that you as a woman are likely to be A, stuck in a reproductive role that puts you in significant health risk, but also means you have very little power and no choice to opt into happiness or to make choices on their side of the house. But two, they have given us no indication for how society is constructed on their side of the house. We do not know how the Northern Sentinel Islands are ruled, but I would wager that they are not democracies. We think that it is likely in a society that the people that are the most powerful, that have the most strength, that have the most resources, are going to dominate this tribe. If you are not born within that narrow group of people that have control, you probably have very little control over what actions you do, your avenue in life. You have no ability to move up. There are still people who are stronger than you, better than you, subjecting you. And at the end of the day, you have no guarantee of human life. We think it's far more likely that you die of childhood mortality or that you die in childbirth on our side of the house. You should weigh that extremely heavily in this round. They are probably going to have a difficult and short, brutish existence. Closing.
Do British people know that their food is bland and tasteless?
We think that in Britain, because of the wonderful globalization and internet, people have learned about things like chicken tikka masala, and that means that people are able to have Second argument then on happiness. Before that, another few items.
So where do malaria and other communicable diseases come from?
Mosquitoes. Okay. What makes people actually happy? Because we think happiness comes when you're able to actually opt into choices that bring you pleasure and that you're able to have meaningful relationships in your life. There are three things that I think you're restricted of on the Northern Sentinel Islands. One, you have very, very little choice, because even if you are born for some reason in the upper stratus of this society, there's a very little range of jobs you can do. There's probably hunter and there's gatherer. And we think that what that means is that if you're not suited to those things, if you are someone who is musical, if you're good with words, if you're good with numbers, you don't know any of that. You're not able to explore any of your passions. At the very least, if you're in a developing country, you have a basic level of schooling, you're able to say, I'm good with my hands, so I prefer to be a carpenter over, for example, a farmer. Or I'm good with plants, so I prefer to opt into this. I think there's a level of choice which means that you're able to feel like you contribute to your community, you feel like you've been useful to the people around you, they're able to excel in your role. We don't think exists in what is probably a highly stratified society on their side of the house. The second thing that I want to note here, though, is that we think that with the rise of AI, you are actually far more likely to have more choices, because this closes the gap between the least productive and the most productive worker. And often things like technology means that things are offshore to developing countries, which gives them more and more opportunities. So we think actually over time, people are going to have to do less work, because AI is going to do more of the productive work that we need to do. do, which means that people have more time to explore the choices they have to. The second thing that I want to talk about is just information. We think that in the Northern Sentinel Islands, there's no proof that they have any kind of writing system, communication with the outside world, or any kind of media that they can consume or enjoy. I think the vast majority of people on Earth have access to the internet, they have access to the television. I think that means that there's an almost endless array of things that are going to give you pleasure. Deep, meaningful literature stories that are going to resonate with you, movies that are going to make you think and laugh and cry with your friends and family. We think that, all of the people that you can meet on the internet, and all the amazing things that exist in the world are highly constrained on their side of the house. The last thing that I want to note here is just maximizing any amount of people and friends and hope that you have. Because on their side of the house, you live in an island where you are probably born into a role and you have very little hope of escaping that role. You have a fixed amount of people, and a very small amount of people in that tribe and in that society. That is a horribly small life to assume that the average person is going to be happy in that context. On our side of the world, you are probably going to meet thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people over the course of your life. The choice that you find someone that is your soulmate, that you love, that you're going to build a family with, is significantly higher. The idea that you're going to find a hobby or find something that brings you pleasure is just innately higher, statistically higher. We think that at the end of the day, in the modern world, you're able to meaningfully opt into the kinds of relationships and hobbies you choose. That brings you happiness. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Let's call upon the second speaker for the government.
I'll get started first, and then you'll be less audible. The reason why OO thinks that the things that they talk about bring them joy is because that has been what they have been conditioned to believe throughout their lifetimes. That the more things I have, the happier I'll be. The more TikTok memes I see, the happier I'll be. The problem here is that the conception of life and the conception of the human experience on these islands are likely to be fundamentally different. We're going to explain why it's fundamentally better as well in the later half of my speech. Let's start, however, with whose life is harder. And there are a couple of interesting things to say about like why the life of these individuals will be really hard. The first thing he said was there's going to be childhood mortality. And like, I guess that's possibly true. I would say that if you die before you had any experiences, then that's a net neutral because you had no experiences whatsoever anyway. So it's unclear how harmful your life would be insofar as you had zero suffering. Second of all, they said, but there will be lots of diseases, so you'll die very young. Okay, look, and the reason why today's POI matters is because, like, a lot of the reason why tribal people in North America died when colonialism happened was because they brought the fucking diseases over, right? Insofar as I think we live in a probable world where there's much less likelihood of these diseases being brought over to the North Sentinel Island, and they've already have herd immunity against the diseases that are on the fucking island, it's much less likely that you'll be dying of more diseases there. You'll probably be living, I won't say like you won't be living until you're 90 or 95, you'll probably be living a pretty good life. I'm not certain that this is the outcome that they want to suggest. Then they said, but you're going to be part of a hunter-gatherer society, and that's really bad because we don't know what they do with the women. I mean, yeah, we don't know what they do with the women because like you only see the men defending the island from the outside, but it is unclear to me why they wouldn't treat women well. Lots of tribal communities do treat women well. Lots of ancient communities had queens, for example, and tribal queens and leaders as well. It was often colonialism and globalization that led to women being treated badly in the first place because they were less economically productive in a capitalistic society than men were. So it's unclear to me whether women will be treated as badly as OO says that they were. I think this is at best speculative. I don't think it should count very far towards the debate. But today gives you a lot of reasons why being born in the real world is pretty shite, right? Even if you don't necessarily die today, there's a high risk that you're going to have more food insecurity in the future. That doesn't happen on outside the house. There's a high risk that if you're born in Somalia, you're going to face climate change disasters. That doesn't happen on outside of the world. I suggest to you that there are plenty of good reasons why even if the risk is as small as they claim, and it isn't because this is a lifetime I'm talking about where many people would potentially face these problems in the next 30 or 40 years, I suggest to you that it is a risk not worth taking because your life is going to be really, really miserable at a point in time when you're a climate refugee, for example. So I think this is the comparative that OO fails to draw. The only actual direct response that Reina has is, but the world wants to fix climate change. Okay lah, I mean, I'm being recorded. You can figure out how, like, whether this is true or not. I would just say that if that's the case, then maybe we would have made a bit more progress than we already have. Yes, Reina?
Okay, so there can be non-climate change disasters. This is a region that is incredibly prone to things like cyclones and hurricanes. How do you deal with that when it destroys your entire life and village?
I don't know, man. They haven't had cyclones for a very long time. Perhaps this is not in the cyclone region. Like, there are plenty of places like Singapore, for instance, where the island isn't prone to earthquakes or tsunamis or all sorts of shit. Like, presumably the North Sentinel Islands are one of those lucky islands, which is why they had a tribal community can flourish for thousands of years. I just don't think this is fucking important to the debate. Can I move on? I think I can. Let's talk about the human experience. And here I think it is important to understand what do humans crave. And I think we, like in general, irrespective of where you are born, generally being sentient comes with a set of things that you would want. First, you probably want a sense of purpose and belonging, because of the fact that that helps you understand your role within the community and your role in the group that you are in. Second, you probably have aspirations and goals, right? That is to say, you probably have things that you want to do that you currently have not done. And third, you probably have a desire for community, i.e. you want to fit in the environment that you are in. The problem is that capitalism as a structure that has permeated the world has created a world where it is functionally impossible to achieve any of these outcomes. That is to say, even if you buy the best case scenario that you live in a Western developed world, it is unclear to me how happy you are. I'm not sure I'm happy when I'm doom scrolling TikTok. The reason for this is very, very simple. The first reason is because capitalism tells you that no matter what you are doing, you will never have achieved enough. Your aspirations and goals must always be replaced by a further goal that makes you more economically productive and makes you want more things than you currently have. This is fundamentally distinct from the world that we are going to live in, where the likelihood is lots of people within these communities have a different conception of what a good life is. A good life is probably one where you take care of your family, where you live a very nice, happy life, where you're finding fucking berries or whatever, and that's what makes you happy. The key here is that there's no point of comparison. That is to say, you don't have the internet, so you don't know that somebody else in Dubai owns a fucking Ferrari that they're driving, and that means that you're more likely than not to be able to be very content with your life. Your aspirations are smaller and your goals are therefore smaller. Being able to achieve those goals within your community makes you happy as well. Closing.
You can choose to be content in your life by not being in round robin. Why do you think you choose to be here?
I don't know, man. I'm just a fucking sadist, right? Like, I think that's the whole point, right? Like, I could not be not here, but I end up being fucking here anyway, right? And that is a problem. That is something that wouldn't exist because somebody somewhere else told me the round robin would be really fun to go to, and you have lots of fun, and you don't be stressed at all debating, all that turns out to be a lie. I think that's the major problem that I think exists on their side of the house that wouldn't exist when you have no access to other experiences. This also applies to things like discrimination or oppression, because I agree, oppression and having a lack of choice is bad, but it's probably a lot less bad when you do not understand that you have other potential things you can do with your life. I.e., if you're born in a role in a society that society from a very young age conditions you to say this is a role that you should be happy with and you should feel good about, and there's no other alternative world conception that you may have, that makes you probably more likely to be happy with the lot that you are in, insofar as your community is smaller, insofar as you feel that you are benefiting your community in a way. This gives you a sense of purpose. You don't get a sense of purpose in any of the lives that they talk about, whether it's in the developing world or the developed world, because every time that you think that you've reached a target, society replaces it with a new target. Every time you feel that you have a sense of purpose, it is taken away by the fact that you see discrimination happening somewhere else. You see oppression, you feel really sad about it, and all of that necessarily means that even if you are happy for brief periods of time, you're never content with the life that you have because you always feel that things could potentially be better, either for yourself or for the people around you. That's not something that people in the North Sentinel community feels, which means that the life that you live is likely to be one that you better actualize the human experience because it has not been tainted by the wrath of capitalists. For these reasons, OG.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the second speaker of the opposition.
opening government assumes that being on this island will allow you to escape the hedonic treadmill, but clearly there are people with more coconuts than you, more wives, and nicer shelters. The whole point of the hedonic treadmill is that it is relative to your set of conditions. The reason you're not happy under the hedonic treadmill is that there's always someone with more. And just because you change the relative proportions of the hedonic treadmill, and you've got 200 people on the island, does not change the fundamental philosophical aspect of the hedonic treadmill in terms of how we experience it, which is that we're not happy because we could have more. Now, I concede there is some limitation to it that potentially exists in the debate, where you don't know about modern technology or as many other things that other societies have. However, the things in front of you that you don't have and that other people on the island do are substantially more tangible and meaningful to you than things other societies have and you know you probably can't, as opposed to the fact that some other dude has more wives than you and you are certain that in some alternate reality that outcome could have happened to you instead. So first I want to talk about quality of life and deal with why the world is not as bad as opening government is saying, and then I'm going to talk about how we actually interpret quality of life and then weigh against CG British experience machine. So let's start on quality of life. I think that there are a variety of interesting structural reasons the opening gov gives about why the world is going to shit. So one is climate change, and I just think that there's been remarkable progress on implementing carbon adjustment mechanisms, carbon taxes, the actual commitments we've seen at the Paris conference that are binding to a large number of states, and the fact that emissions in much of the Western world on a per capita basis are significantly decreasing, alongside China's significant incentives to reduce emissions, which mean that this problem is more likely to be solved than not. The reality is that there are very large incentives for governments to help firms internalize their externalities, which have happened far too slowly, but the worst case situations of oceans rising to a significant proportion and putting New York underwater are probably not likely. Second, yes, it is obviously true that climate-related disasters are out of this debate, but the reason why, by the way, the people were killed who came to the island at North Sentinel, that they were coming to try to give aid because of the hurricane that happened in 2006. And they were killed because they were not accepting aid that was given to the island in terms of material supplies. So yes, natural disasters do happen. Now, I recognize that there's an ambiguity in the motion here, where the motion says, if you are born on the island, you will not experience any climate change disasters. What implications that has for the rest of the world, I do not know. Rena provides a plausible reason, which is that if it is true that this island metaphysically cannot experience climate change disasters and is close to the equator, then probably the rest of the world would not. But second, just because there can't be major climate change related disasters does not mean that the slow impact of climate change on like air quality or rising sea levels encroaching on their nice beach where they fished cannot still happen. So either interpretation of the motion, whether it's like metaphysically stopped or not, it seems like the outcome is relatively fine. On AI, I just think David O'Toore's argument is right, and like AI is likely to upskill lower skilled workers and provide much more employment to the workers who are less productive compared to the ones who are most. I also think that a world in which there's a much larger wealth surplus as a result of AI means that the world is vastly wealthier, means that there's more money to donate to charities that significantly alleviate extreme poverty in the developing world, and a wide variety of other things that mean that AI probably won't reduce meaning totally. Also, if you're a worker and you're automated by AI, the government has significant incentive to redistribute that wealth to you, then you have more time for your hobbies because you're on a UBI or some other type of mechanism. So that outcome, again, doesn't seem as bad as they're saying. Last, they say you should be extremely risk averse. And the 1 to 2% chance that you could be born in absolute extreme poverty, even if there's also a 1 to 2% chance that you could be born extremely wealthy, should be discounted. Now, I think it is intuitive that people might sometimes be risk averse, but it's actually not clear why people wouldn't gamble. Same thing with the veil of ignorance. Maybe you would gamble. Maybe you'd want a system where you could feel that you have some hope. And I just think that the likely outcome of even being born quite poor in a rural area, or absolute worst case, which is like lower on the percentage likelihood, you still have a family, you still have basic food security because you own a farm. Yes, it's not as diverse, but it's probably roughly similar to the type of food security you have in their world. Notice that basic food security is not, in my mind, the same as you have a diverse diet of many different things and you eat very well. It means you have enough to survive, in my mind, and it's not disrupted. So that compared to like owning a farm and occasionally not having good harvest seems relatively similar even in our worst days. How do you interpret happiness? Before I go on, opening up.
So a lot of these communities end up being quite egalitarian because unfairness is very apparent and tangible, and even if there is inequality, it is accepted once it is socially conditioned in you.
Yeah, you mentioned that a lot of ancient societies had queens who were all respected. I think that gets to the point that Rena was saying, which is that there were some elite women who were venerated, but the vast majority of women in the social ladder were significantly at the bottom, had a reproductive function, maybe they did some hunting and gathering. There were all these studies that came out a long time ago about how like hunter-gatherer societies secretly worked, like 20 hours a week and had a great time. Those studies were broadly debunked because it appears that the way that they looked that the value of work was extremely flawed and ideological, I think that the reality of being a woman in one of these societies is that even if you are empowered, the empowerment is broadly to like look for berries in a dangerous forest full of dangerous animals. Yes, maybe you're not going to immediately die, but it still does not seem like a good life. I concede that some illnesses, by the way, are brought in by outsiders, but like malaria just exists in mosquitoes. It comes through the ecosystem of various animals. And lots of other diseases like bacteria are not just brought in by other people, they just exist in the natural environment. The inability to have antibiotics or to prevent early childbirth is bad. I concede that if you are a 2-year-old, you will not experience death, but it probably doesn't mean it's justified for 2-year-olds to die. And also it could be your 2-year-old who dies, or your cousin, or your brother, and so on. It's very traumatizing. Closing.
Oh yeah, like what's all this work they have to do? They don't have to pay rent.
Yeah, obviously, but the point is that surviving in a scarce environment where you don't have machinery and mechanical things that help you to make your work more productive means that a lot of your labor is physical, right? If you're building a shelter, that is man-hours spent actually building the shelter. You're hunting an animal, you need like 10 dudes to carry the animal and bring it back. Surviving is incredibly hard. The reason the hunter-gatherers spend so long on subsistence is that you don't have agriculture, right? The reason societies became more productive is that you can centralize resources and put wealth into places rather than relying just on human labor. So the fact that you don't have things that make you more productive, like the end point of this, which is like ultimately AI, right, is the reason why you are doing a ton of work. No, you don't have to pay the rent. No, there's no capitalist system. But the reality is that you have to do a lot of things just to baseline survive and have baseline food security, and that is still very bad. How do you interpret quality of life? Now, I understand what closing government is saying here, that sometimes there are contexts where you think you have it really good, but you're actually trapped and you don't realize how bad it actually is. I suggest that's actually what's going on in open government's case as well. People might be happy, but they don't realize how actually terrible their lives are, even in their worst case. They're still experiencing inputs and outputs, which on a physical level are harming them, because they're likely to like, have physical pain. And even if they don't understand what is happening to them, it is still a bad outcome that is happening to them. But moreover, I think the reasons Rena provided about meaning in life are actually relatively important. It's not about scrolling through TikTok. It's about the fact that you live in an information environment full of friends, ideas, media, which relate to you. You could be a woman, you could be gay, you could be any number of different identities and have any number of different values that you may want to express. Yes, this is bounded to a degree. You can't always be a computer engineer no matter where you're born, though there are shocking levels of intra-country mobility and inter-class mobility in rapidly growing developing countries. But our argument was that you could reach out. No, you wouldn't always be satisfied, but it's not always that you just set a new target and are never happy. You're happy that you met that target. Yes, you continue on the hedonic treadmill, but you're happy with your progress. You feel that you're doing relatively better. Your life isn't static because you're making your way up. You have goals, you have meaning because you are achieving something. And being able to reach out for that more information, that more meaning, is what provides a lot of value to people. We are very proud to defend it.
Thank you very much for that speech. I call publicly to speak up for the matter.
There's a well-studied group of hunter-gatherers called the Hadza, and they live in Tanzania. And one of the things that researchers notice after leaving them and going back to society, or the sort of modern society, is just how miserable they are. Because one of the things they notice when they're hanging around there is when they get people in their car and drive them around a bit, just how joyous people are. They're able to just be completely carefree. They sing songs, they make them up on the spot. They spend the vast majority of their time just hanging out and dancing and sharing food and doing whatever else, because being a hunter-gatherer costs so little work. Because in our modern society, sure, we have complex goals that most of us fail to live up to. We have all of these desires and all these fantastic networks in society. We pay for that in two ways, without the omnipresent stress of having to manage all of these competing ideas, but also with the significant time cost when we live in a crowded society where we have the most extraordinary appetites. So I'll start this speech by talking about how life is just so bad outside North Sentinel Island. And here we'll go beyond opening government's sort of like tangential reference of the hedonic treadmill, okay, and tail risk, where first of all, we'll deal with the best case, which is logically stronger, saying like, even if you were born into like the upper classes of a highly developed society, that life is still not very good. But second of all, I think it's kind of obvious that you do care about the rest of the distribution. People are willing to gamble. People who marry take a gamble, because a divorce is far worse than not having got married. Or for instance, having a child is a huge risk as well. Many people happily take them, and that's rational. And so we should care about the rest of the distribution, but also insofar as we prove the best case, that provides the far strongest justification for government ban. So, we would note that almost everyone in the world has to do incredible amounts of work for the vast majority of their life. Even the wealthiest people, because they're jockeying for status, because they're jockeying for consumption of ever more expensive goods. And this extends to housework as well, for people who aren't full-time employed. And this is accompanied with full-time stress, where you have to provide for other people in your family, where you know there are all of these goals per opening opposition's characterization that you're working towards that are so important that you can't bear the thought of not living up to them. And so what is there to enjoy? You don't have the money that you wanted, you don't even have that much spare time to enjoy the things that you are able to achieve, and when you do have that spare time, your friends are busy and don't have that spare time, you're exhausted because you've been at work all that time, or you're with your family who you feel distant from because you've been away from them for so long trying to provide for them, or you resent them because your life has been basically devoted, basically one big sacrifice in order to look after them. And sure, opening opposition has the internet or AI, which might hopefully do something, but this is pretty empty solace when by far the most important things that matter are just like being able to enjoy things stress-free. The reason TikTok is popular is because people feel empty inside. That is the reason that the best case outside North Sentinel Island is bad. Opening up POI?
Yes, so the Sentinel Islands are incredibly hostile, there's dangerous wildlife, there are natural disasters, and because you have no fridges, you have no machinery, it takes an immense amount of work to even have a house and to have food. Should you work 24/7 to meet your basic needs?
Yeah, I'll respond to that soon. Also, be comparative, you do have to work nearly 24/7 to satisfy most of your basic needs. Closing?
Not now.
Okay, so on North Sentinel Island, opening government points out you don't starve. I think that's a necessary but not sufficient condition for happiness. And then they talk about finding meaning in picking berries, which I think might perhaps be a little bit undercooked. What we're going to note are two things that I'll respond to opening opposition stuff first, about how society on North Sentinel Island sucks. The first observation they have is that they kill outsiders, but they also have a large number of peaceful encounters. Like, there are often people who come up and float along coconuts and they kind of wave. They just keep a really big distance between them. That's being peaceful. But also we would note that, like, often killing outsiders isn't a sign of being mean within the society. Like, there are certain drugs that really ramp up people's empathy, but what it does is increase people's empathy within an in-group while increasing highly discriminatory tendencies. That is, people's behaviour towards outsiders is often completely orthogonal to their behaviour towards insiders. And so insofar as they shot a missionary, that doesn't mean that they are actually going to be evil to people within the society with whom they have to cooperate. The second thing I say is we've only seen men. This doesn't speak to evil sexism, it just speaks to a division of labour, whereby the people who are born with the strongest bodies are probably the ones you want to be having do the most dangerous things, but also insofar as there are different roles for men and women. Sure, it is different, but often it is largely equal insofar as each role respects the other enough and recognises their necessity in this. Sure, it's not ideal, but it's certainly not like hell on earth, Handmaid's Tale sort of stuff, which is how they're making out to be. Closing?
Now that you know about this island, would you pack your bags and go there tomorrow?
No, because the thing is I have ties to people in this world, and that would be kind of giving up all my duties. I quite like my friends and my family. The final thing they say is you're probably going to have really bad health. First of all, not really. Like, they're quite healthy. If you break a bone, you can set it. They've learned how to solve most of these problems. They look after people who have disabilities because they just rely on each other, and it's the sort of implicit promise, if I look after you, you look after me. Second of all, I think it's a risk worth taking. But third of all, be comparative. People in the developed world often have all sorts of awful health diseases because they're not living a fantastic active lifestyle of picking berries and swimming on the reef. So, why are things better on our side? First of all, you have far more spare time. Human needs are quite little. You have shelter. I'm not sure how many huts opening opposition thinks you have to build every day. You have to build one every 2 or 3 months, per person at most, if you're moving around the island. And they're not very, they can be pretty flimsy because you've got a tree canopy above you. And beyond that, I don't really know what you need to do. You need food, they're in the fridge, no, you can kill food fresh. Catching fish is actually really easy, and we would note that these are highly sophisticated technologies that have thousands of years of cultural evolution behind them. I'm sure they've figured out how to save a hell of a lot of energy, and they know where all the good food is. They know how to be able to catch all of this stuff. And so, Like the Hadza, they work 12 hours per week. They spend the rest of their lives lying about, singing and dancing. They say it's a hostile environment. It is tropical. That's where the most abundant stuff is. The sea is swarming with fish. The reason there is scarcity outside North Sentinel Island is because of crowding, where you have to pay for rent, where you're competing against other renters. It's not because it's really, really, really hard to provide for the very, very limited human needs that these people are able to satisfy. And we were known that living by the beach in a warm tropical environment, where you are surrounded by the people who are closest to you, where you spend most of your time dancing, this is what people in the first world grind hours for, hoping that they can get 1 or 2 weeks a year where they can go to the seaside. Like, sure, maybe they've got air conditioning, but like, who cares? This is the life that everyone envies. The second thing, though, is that these people, okay, this is pretty contentious, so I'll skip over that. Basically, these people have very short time horizons. They don't have stress or dashed hopes because they've never had a need to plan ahead, because they've always been able to provide for their needs so effectively. This is a life that people, even the most well-off, envy. They are free from stress, they are surrounded by people they like. Most importantly, they have the time in which to enjoy it. And that's why closing government has to take it.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'll call upon the third speaker to the opposition.
Clarification, don't verbally heckle me. I'll take a POI, I'll take 2, so feel free to raise your hand. Also, like, my voice is dead, so be a little more generous. Thank you. Ready? Starting in 3, 2. Oh wait, where's C? Oh right. Yeah, sorry, I really confused that. I'm really sorry. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. The Gov bench is looking at the book Thousand Splendid Suns and going like, I won't read this because this has the saddest fucking story, which deprives them of some of the most amazing experiences a human being can have. 2 pieces of framing. First, I think we were islanders to begin with. That's how evolution happened. We were once there, but we chose not to be stuck in that system because that's what human beings inherently like. Secondarily, I think we're also at a very specific point in life where we have access to literally everything in terms of intellectual capacity, awareness, and information. Please, like, I don't think this debate is grandly about mechanization, but I'll do it regardless. 4 reasons. First, media is grandly accessible. It's literally on your phone. You can know about what's happening in Israel and Palestine without even making an effort. Secondarily, there are whistleblowers. This is great because that fucks up a lot of really powerful people that they're saying are going to control the world without any challenges. Third degree, I think we're also at a very unique point in time where my sister defended me when I wanted to come to America. This is important because narratives are being shaken, because there are people who are growing up and literally cracking down on the system that oppressed them. I think we're also at the point of the most highest amount of engagement and discussion. This is great because I think people do get to choose. Are there oppression? Sure. But do people get or have a chance at breaking them? I think so. I'm going to do 2 things. First, give you the principal idea of why awareness and choice is incredibly important. This is A, prior to our opening. Because I'm going to tell you as a human what should you choose at the point in time you're given choices between an arbitrary life or a random as oblivion. Secondarily, I'm going to tell you that the hedonistic treadmill allowed us to actualize our rights and morals in community. These are simpler impacts. We don't have to be the CEO of a damn community. But the fact that I'm a Muslim and I can connect over that with my mom over prayers is one of the most beautiful things that has happened to me in my life. Very quickly, what are human beings? Here's a principle. If you're cheated on, you'd want to know. Me as a kid wanted to know if I was adopted, even though it would have broken my whole damn life because my sister bullied me. This is important because human beings inherently value information and access to those information to make acknowledged choices or individualized choices so that they can maximize the amount of opportunity, because we as human beings want to feel at the utmost epitome of choices. This is why we segregate ourselves from animals and put ourselves on a superior level. This is why we consume animals and feel the need that we can do so because we're somewhat superior. Human beings believe that apart from God, the only person who gets to A, make choices, but has B, ability to have the most amount of information are there. This is true for 4 different reasons. First, you do research. I don't know why the purpose of it exists. It exists because human beings think collectively we deserve to know about everything, whether it's outer space, inside space, or freaking quantum mechanics. Secondarily, sticking to a sport like debate. I mean, you can just choose to have a better life. This is the POI, right? You have access to information where you can live like those islanders, but you choose not to because you think that competitive sport, whether you take a 4 or not, is somewhat gonna grow your character and you're gonna come at the stake of it. Secondarily, that's the same reason I'm trying to go up the economic ladder, even though I know all the stakes are up against me, whether I'm a person of color or a certain religion. This is important because human beings want to have exposure and experience. Whether it's good or bad, it's the fact that they've been there, done that, and can speak to that experience and cherish even the worst memories in nature is something that they value so intrinsically. This is important because note, this is where I want to characterize the OG. The DPM, I tell you, you're an adult with intellectual abilities and you are in US. You know that you can also not be in round robin and choose to have a better life in general where you like sit at your home over a pizza and binge watch. But you choose to do so because that's what humans in general are wired towards doing better for themselves or life, or the very hedonistic treadmill that has been created is something that is a choice. If you've seen Ashish, you know that he has access to information, so he's retired. So the fact that people actively choose not to retire and run behind materialistic things like owning a house and a car essentially means that they value those things. So as a human, if I'm prone and incapable of not valuing materialistic and capitalism, because by the way we created it, is the very reason which I think you'd rather arbitrarily choose to go this. I think this is incredibly important because it's a principle that stands regardless of time and test and just in general all of their benefits. Let's then very quickly get to utility. I'm going to do a bunch of things here. First, marginal diminishing utility that they want to claim. I think that's what happened, right? Human beings ran out of efficiency, so we created automation. If automation isn't working, we're upskilling human beings with intellectual abilities so that they get jobs. Now that AI is stealing your jobs, it's literally a conversation. We're trying to protect jobs and make sure there are policies in place to protect people. This is incredibly important. The only way we were able to actualize that women deserve to vote and Black Lives Matter is because the capitalistic structure existed and human beings, after oppressing, realized who shouldn't and be oppressed. That's what the islanders lack. More importantly, I think this is good. The very reason oppression exists is the reason why Sandeep was able to go out to the street and go against Rajapaksa and actually were overthrown. This is incredibly important because people were damn able to materialize what the fuck they deserve and what the hell they don't deserve. This has a bunch of really important things. A, I think people just feel powerful on the ground when they're able to do things like this. 3, they're able to build community. I think the fact that there's cross interaction between a bunch of other religions is freaking beautiful. Is where people are able to set aside their notions and their differences, is when you build these smaller impacts. Because I think people want to be sad, but at the same time they create these beautiful magical moments which are simpler and easy to do. Before I move on to opening.
Your basic needs are met, you aren't stressed about potentially not having food on the table, you have better interpersonal relations, you have goals on both sides, but the goals you choose on our side are more tractable and don't seem insignificant.
I'm going to get to that
ocean of
before
oppression.
that closing too.
Yeah, life on the island isn't something completely devoid of anything of interest. You still have complex relationships, you still have like a very rich cultural mythology and so
The
on.
beautiful, for the first word is, I think community in its diverse, nuanced nature is something better. In islanders, you'll probably have some capacity of some morals and relation, but here I'm able to have struggles with my mom where I relate on womanhood, where I relate on being on a foreign land that we go through together. The exposure to struggling together is also essentially beautiful moments that are absolutely absent, because I think the lack of struggles also mean the emotional depth in islanders are essentially gone. This is important because the impacts are simple. You find purpose in life, you find meaning in life, and you find happiness in literally the smallest thing because you struggle so much. There is beauty in struggle because right after the storm there's the calm, and people are able to do things like that. If you know Juba, you know how much happiness he gets out of math. If you know Sandeep, you have no idea how much happiness he gets out of human rights law, even though there's so much to be discussed. The fact that human beings have collectively decided that we want to figure shit out together, and whether the challenges are overarching or not, means that things like protesting happen, things like research happen, and today we get to sit here and discuss this conversation. And I think that's rather philosophical that an islander wouldn't do.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the final speaker for the gathering. Yeah, jacket pocket or something.
Everyone in the debate so far has largely just conceded this comes down to in which place are you happier. The question we should then ask is, what determines whether or not you are happy? What is it that makes you happy? A very wise man once said to me that happiness is really just the difference between your expectations and your reality. And the simple argument that we make at closing opposition is just that when you live on the island, your expectations are substantially lower, substantially closer to the reality that you can achieve, which is why you are actually happy. The world of the real world, or the modern world, is one where your expectations are set sky high, and in a way that you just can never achieve, which is why you cannot be happy in that context. And Mark gives you a series of very easy ways to understand why that is the case. If you think about the kinds of things that make humans happy, they tend to be very simple things that we're just evolutionarily inclined to enjoy. Things like having a sense of connection, which makes sense that it would be something that makes us happy because we are social animals, and having community and feeling wanted and desired and engaged by other people, something that necessarily will make you feel good. And that's something that's very easy to do on the island because you are required to be part of a community. It's the only way to survive. It's very strong pressure to have that community. But by contrast, as we explain, it's very unlikely to be something you engage in very substantially on the counterfactual because people struggle to connect. We're atomized by things like social media, by modern society, by the fact that your friends are so busy working that they can't hang out with you, the fact that you don't live with your family because you're expected to move out as soon as you turn 18 because of the reality of the modern world. It's things like a desire to live in the moment and just appreciate the things that you have and to actually be grateful for them, which is very easy when, the most simple things that occur to you just make you happy. Like, as I point out in a POI, if you're a British person before you've discovered spices, like salted beef tastes fantastic to you because you could never conceptualize something tasting better. It's very easy to be grateful when you live on the island because every meal is something that you aren't certain you would ever be able to get. It's something that you're grateful for, that your community is able to continue to exist and continue to prosper. But in the modern world, it's very hard to live in the moment because you expect all of those things. You take them for granted and you have constant struggles and anxieties and worries about the future that pile on top of you. The bills that you need to pay, the job that you need to get, the risk that your friends might not be your friends anymore or might be seeking to undermine you. And finally, we just point out that the stress that exists around you is constant and is likely to make your life bad. On the Sentinel Island, your life is incredibly simple. It's things like, acquiring food, building shelter, and then just spending time with your community. It's low stress, and there isn't a very large amount of work needed to maintain that lifestyle. The argument we get from the opposition bench is no, it's actually really hard to engage in the subsistence lifestyle. You need to spend hours and hours doing so. But I think it's relatively intuitive that this is not the case. For example, even in modern society, most people could choose to work far fewer hours than, say, 40 hours a week if they were willing to sacrifice very substantially on their quality of life. The reason they don't do so is because living a life that is substantially worse than those around you is intolerable. It's comparison that is the problem. It's the expectations that prevent you from doing that. But that doesn't exist on the island. It's very easy to just, hunt enough food that you need to eat, which is not very much food, and just live in a very simple shelter. And that doesn't require as much time. It's only when you feel the need to maximize the quality of what you have in order to compete with other people for status that particular risk accrues. And the important thing here is opening opposition has a response, which is to say the hedonistic treadmill runs both ways and you acclimatize on either side. So even if it's the case that, on the island the expectations are lower, you still fail to meet them and feel bad about them. The important distinction we make here is that it's a gap between reality and expectations that is different. And that is because on the Sentinel Island, it's relatively equal. The difference in status between the highest and lowest person is very close together, which means that the maximum amount of unhappiness you can experience is low. Compare that to modern society, where the gap in inequality is extremely large. Why is that true? A couple of very easy reasons to believe this. Firstly, wealth is related to effort on the island because we don't have concepts like technology, corporations, or capital, which can be force multipliers for how rich you can become. Like the richest islander is just someone who hunts a bit better than someone else, so you're unlikely to be much richer. Secondly, because it's a communitarian society, so resources are largely collectively owned and shared, and that makes sense because it's a good measure for risk mitigation and insurance. If you hunt badly, you don't want to starve to death, so it makes sense for everyone to want to share those resources. Thirdly, because of specialization, different people are good at different tasks. In the absence of a system of capitalism, there's no way to trade those resources. It's much easier to just agree to pool the resources and share them, which is why you're likely to do that. Which also explains, in response to opening opposition's claim of women will be treated poorly, no, because they have important leverage in the society because they're specialized in different tasks. Often, for example, the men hunted and the women gathered, because hunting is a riskier proposition. You want the insurance of being able to have the berries or whatever, which is why they have leverage vis-a-vis you, and they're likely to be treated well. And finally, just a need for buy-in from all those people, which is why you're likely to engage well with them. Which explains why it's very hard to be much lower in status than anyone else. It's much harder to feel like you're missing out, because even if you're the lowest member of that society, the richest member is 2 rungs above you. You could easily imagine having that, or that being you. And in the vast majority of cases, you feel collective ownership of all the resources, so it's impossible to feel like you're missing out on anything. Yep.
So the gap between the wealthiest islander and the small islander may be materially small, but your entire knowledge of the world and framework for the world is based on what is available to you on the island. So the difference between island 7 on the scale versus 8 on the scale of wealth is actually interpreted to be very significant to you.
No, I just don't think that's true. For half the reasons I just provided explanations why all resources are collectively owned, so it's not even clear there's any difference there. But even if that was the case, there's clearly a big difference between you knowing that a billionaire exists and has trillions of times the things that you could ever have, and a quality of life you could never experience, and knowing that someone has a bit more food than you, that is obviously far more tolerable and far less likely to make you unhappy. But that also doesn't engage with all of the additional reasons we give you. The final thing I want to deal with, and this is both CO's extension and at times part of opening opposition's case, is the idea of choice and that you lose out on choice. The response to this is incredibly simple. Choice doesn't give you happiness, it causes unhappiness, so it's actually a detriment for the opposition bench in this debate. Why is that the case? Firstly, because choice tends to create things like paralysis, and the reason for that is, when you have a choice, you have to give something up to get something else. There's a trade-off, there's an opportunity cost, so you're necessarily going unfulfilled. When you choose to do one thing, you forego the opportunity to do the other thing, and the more choices you have, the more you forego, and the less you get, so you feel worse about it. When you have no choice, you just get a thing and you feel really glad for it. It's the expectations argument reframed another way. When you have lots of choice, you have a capacity to expect lots of things, and you feel bad when you don't get them. But when you have no choice, you just have a thing and you feel great, because the only thing you could expect is the thing that you have, and you necessarily feel fulfilled. At the end of the debate, this is very simple to adjudicate. You feel happy when you get what you want, and you do that on side opposing opposition, opposing government.
Thank you very much for that speech. I call for the final speaker for the opposition.
I will also take HWS non-verbally. Cool. Start speaking. In 3, 2, 1. I think CO was the only one to tell you why, when you constantly pursue for a better life that is materialistic, that it asks you to question things that actively stop you from pursuing those kinds of things. That if you have a patriarchal society that does not allow you to vote, for instance, it is only when you know that you deserve to vote that you are able to fight for those kinds of things, because you know that there is something better that exists in the US that I don't necessarily have in Sri Lanka, that motivates me to do a significantly better job than I do right now. I'm going to deal with CG, then tell you, and deal with OG, then tell you why we explicitly waive opening opposition, who told you that the word is relatively bad, and I think we don't necessarily have to prove that, and I think actually the word being not necessarily the greatest is absolutely fine for our case to be. Cool. Let's deal with CG. They told me two things. One, that lowering your expectations are good, which is hilarious, and two, that you have to work really hard and that's bad. Firstly, on lowering expectations and why that's necessarily a bad thing, I think it's three things. One, because when you lower your expectations, it necessarily asks you to be satisfied with things that you are probably going to be dissatisfied on our side. Meaning that if your society is patriarchal, you are asking their word to be complacent with it because there is nothing better that you can pursue. On our side, when you know that there is something that is alternative to that, you are pursuing something that is significantly better. But two, it suggests that meaning is perfectly satisfied when you have your basics fulfilled. I don't think that's how humans function. I think it's interesting because they tell me the exact same thing, right? That the way in which you distinguish between who gets a little bit more and a little bit less is by somebody who works a little bit harder. That suggests then that there is still competition and that there is still self-interest on their side, meaning that people will still compete. The difference though is when you compete on their side, it's significantly more disproportionate as to who can actually access those kinds of competition. Because if it is on the basis of hard work, it suggests things that manual labor that traditionally men are considered to be relatively better at, meaning that only small groups and pockets of people actually access those kinds of things. The second and more intuitive claim was that hard work is necessarily bad and that's why the modern world sucks.